Our second scripture today is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9, verses 18 to 26. While he was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader of the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died. But come, lay your hand on her, and she will live." Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Then suddenly a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And the report of this spread throughout the district. This is Matthew's version of one of my favorite stories in the Bible. But I was pleased or curious to see that I've never preached on Matthew's version before. It's always been Mark or Luke, and those two are very, very similar to one another. Matthew's is very different than the other two. It's much shorter, it has fewer details, and it seems to have a completely different concern than the other two. This short passage in Matthew seems to be telling us one thing alone, and that is that a simple touch, either from Jesus or a touch of Jesus, is enough. That's enough. See if that works better. Maybe? Okay. So there he is, and one of the leaders of the synagogue shows up, and he comes to Jesus and he says, "Jesus, my young daughter has just died. If you come, all you need to do is just touch her, and she will be restored to us." It's a crazy idea. Everybody knows that dead is dead. But Jesus gets up and goes with this leader of the synagogue. And he arrives at the house, and the professional mourners are already there. They did things a little differently in those days. When someone died, you hired people to come and help you mourn. And so the professional mourners were there, and some of them were wailing and crying and beating their chests. Others were playing music. It was pandemonium. And Jesus walks into this where all of this is going on, and he says, "Stop. Go away. Because the girl's not dead, she's only sleeping." Well, these people are professionals. They know. Dead is dead. They've seen it before. They've been there before. They make their living there. They know all about it. Dead is dead. And they laugh at him. We probably wouldn't have laughed. We would have just kind of shrugged and said, "Yeah, right." But they laughed. Finally, though, he shoos them out of the house, and he goes into the room where the body of the little girl is, and he takes her by the hand, and he leads her outside. I can't imagine what that looked like. I can't imagine the reaction. Because they hadn't heard anything. There was no loud incantations or magical chants or something like that. There was no strong command like the one we read in Lazarus. "Lazarus, come out!" None of that. Just Jesus walks out holding this little girl by the hand. I don't know. A simple touch was enough. And dead was not dead any longer. Well, on the way from where he was to the synagogue leader's home, there was an interruption. In Luke and Mark's version, that interruption is really the central part of the story. It doesn't get nearly as much here. But there is this interruption, and a woman touches Jesus' cloak. Now, Jewish people knew the power of touch. It was built into the law. Now, the power of touch they knew was not a pleasant one, because if you touched the wrong thing, you were suddenly unclean. And sometimes, if you touched the wrong thing, you were unclean for a long, long time. And it was a real fear, because if you were unclean, you were set off from everyone else. You couldn't go to worship. You couldn't do all of the community things that people did. You were kept away from public places, because if you were unclean and sat down on a public chair and then someone else sat on it, they were then unclean. So you didn't want to get unclean. People avoided lepers, not just because they were afraid of contagion, but also because they were afraid that they might be made unclean even if they never got sick. When we read the story of the Good Samaritan and we see the priest and the Levite seeing the body of the man who had been attacked and beaten lying on the side of the road, and they cross by on the other side, it wasn't only because of a lack of compassion. They were afraid they'd be unclean. If they touched a dead body, they were unclean for 7 days. That was assuming that they did the right rituals during those 7 days. If they messed up on that, it'd be another 7 days. They were afraid that even if he was still alive and they touched him and they got his blood on them, they would be unclean. So perhaps part of the reason they passed by on the other side was because they knew they had a role in the community that they needed to fulfill. And if they were rendered unclean, they wouldn't be able to fulfill that. Women had that power even more than men. Because at least once a month, women, until they become women of a certain age, were unclean. By definition, women were unclean part of the time. If women gave birth to a child, if it was a boy, 30 days, unclean. If it was a girl, 90. Unclean. She knew that because she had this issue of blood for 12 years, she had been unclean and no one would touch her. No one. Not her children, not her husband, not her friends, no one. She couldn't go to public places because if she sat here on the front pew, that pew would render anyone who ever sat on it unclean. She was completely cut off. Completely cut off. She knew that the power of her touch had the power to disrupt other people's lives and make them unclean, to push them to the margins from wherever they found themselves. She knew the power of her touch to change everything. But she believed that the power of Jesus' touch likewise could disrupt everything, but in the other direction. That if she had the power to make things unclean, he had the power to make things clean. And indeed, he didn't even have to consciously touch something, just to touch him. After all, she knew that she didn't have to be conscious of it. If she sat on the chair and someone else sat there, it wasn't her fault. She hadn't reached out and touched them, but they were unclean. So she thought the same thing would be true of Jesus, only in the other direction. She could just touch the hem of his garment as he walked by, and that would make her whole. Of course, she knew there was the very real possibility that that wouldn't happen. That she would touch the hem of his garment, and instead of her becoming whole, he would become unclean. And she could imagine what would happen if she did that. Here was a whole community of people gathered to see what they could get from Jesus. Some of them wanted to hear words of grace. Some of them needed to know a sense of forgiveness. Some of them had come to be healed just like her. And if she made him unclean, none of that would happen. They would not have been pleased. And that doesn't even begin to say, what would he think of a woman who had touched him and separated him from his calling, had separated him from even being able to go to worship? Still, she persisted. And she took the chance. And she touched. And that is the point of Matthew's story here. Just a touch was enough. A touch from Jesus, or even a touch of Jesus. Now, we talked about this passage on Tuesday in Bible study, and the discussion very quickly moved from Jesus' touch and these miraculous kinds of things to just talking about touch and the way that it impacts us in our lives. And I have to say, I'm not going to go into everything that was said there, but there were some things that were said in Bible study that really I had never thought of. And it was really, really very helpful. So that inspired me, and this week I started reading about touch. And you know, there have been lots of studies and lots of scientific work on touch since about the 1950s. It all started with one of the studies that was kind of cruel, but fascinating even in its cruelty, where the researcher took baby rhesus monkeys and separated them from their mothers and put them in a cage. And in the cage, there were two mothers. There was one that was made of wire mesh, and the one with wire mesh had a bottle inside it kind of sticking out so the baby could nurse from the wire mesh mother. And then the second one was covered with something warm and soft and fuzzy. And the babies went to the warm, soft, fuzzy one and starved to death, even though the wire mesh one was right there. Well, I learned some other fun things about touch. Most mammals spend between 10 and, primates. Most primates spend between 10 and 20% of their time grooming one another. 20% of their time touching each other. We've all heard those stories of human children who are not touched or who are touched inappropriately, and so they don't develop physically, socially, or intellectually as well as children who are touched more. This next one was really fun. The amount of touch that we have is cultural. This researcher went around the world and he would get a pair of people and sit them at a table and watch them talk and count the number of times they touched each other in an hour. The Brits, 0. We Americans, we're really, really demonstrative. Twice. The French shoots up 110 times.
Whoa.
Puerto Rico, are you ready for this? 1 hour, the friends, talking at a table, touched each other an average of 180 times. Those of us who've been there say, well, yeah, that's right. That's it. Basketball teams that touch each other have higher winning records. So when you see those athletes patting each other on behind, those are the ones you put your money on. Have you ever been at a restaurant and when the waiter or waitress, when they bring the bill, they lean over and touch you on the arm? Waiters and waitresses who touch their patrons get up to 36% higher tips. Marriage where there is more touching is happier. And it doesn't matter what kind of good touch it is. People who touch more are less violent. Touch strengthens your immune system. You're less likely, we get so afraid of touching people because we might get germs. It's actually better for you. We know what touch means. They did this one fascinating study where they built a wall and just put a hole large enough for a person to stick their arm through. And then they would have two strangers, and they had 8 emotions that you were supposed to communicate. And one person would stick their arm through the hole, and the other person would touch their arm. And they had cards, and they would hold up a card and say, okay, communicate this. They had 8 choices. And then the other person was supposed to say, this is what they're communicating. Well, logic would tell you there'd be a 1 in 8 chance of getting it right. It was much, much higher than that. And the one that people got right the most often was compassion. 60% of the time, they got it right. Now, interestingly enough, the times when it was least likely to be understood was when the gender of the two were different. Men and women obviously both express and experience touch differently than each other. But just touch, no verbal, no visual cues, and we still got it more often than not. Here's the bad part. In our culture, people touch each other less now than they ever have before. And it's getting less and less all the time. Part of it because we're afraid. You know, from our very youngest days, we have our kids teaching them about bad touch and good touch. And the idea is, you've got to be really careful. And part of it is just that we live our lives in such a way that we are isolated from one another. And so we don't do it. Some researchers even think that the reason why we're seeing such an increase in treatment modalities like massage and chiropractors has less to do with the actual work that they do than with the fact that people are just hungering to be touched. Just hungering to be touched. Now, clearly there are kinds of touch that are bad. We know about that. And there is some positive in teaching children, there's a lot of positive in teaching children how to understand the difference between good touch and bad touch. But it's not just sexual stuff that's bad. There are also times when you touch someone in a way that's inappropriate for the depth of the relationship. We all remember that video of then President Bush massaging the shoulders of Angela Merkel and her going, because that isn't something you do with someone that's not your friend, and she didn't see herself as his friend. And there are some people who just don't want to be touched, and that's fine. That's their business if that's what they want. But as I thought about this passage and went the next step beyond the miraculous, which is clearly, part of the passage. But it struck me that there is an everyday piece in it as well. That simple touch equals life. Wholeness and healing. There's a reason when we pray for folk for something important, we lay hands on them. Because touch is important. There's a reason why when we say grace around the table, we hold hands. Because touch is important. Touch equals life. I want to say this carefully, but it's important. And I'm going to trust each of us who are here listening, and if anybody watches this on YouTube, I'm trusting that they're going to have some wisdom about appropriateness. But here's the point, I think, of the passage for us. Not just that a simple touch from Jesus is enough, although that would be enough in and of itself, but that we need to touch. We need to touch more. And so what I would like each of us to do this week is to be more aware of touching. Maybe reach out and take someone's hand. If you find yourself today watching television with someone, lean into them. Lean into them. If they're close enough, maybe snuggle a bit. If you run into somebody this week and they've done something that's really positive, pat them on the back. Another fascinating study that they did was about dating. And they found that they would have very attractive men go into a club, and while people are dancing, they would go up to a woman and ask her to dance. And if before asking, just touched her lightly on the arm, she was way more likely to say yes. And then they took it the next step, and they had these same really attractive men go out on the street and walk up to strange women and ask them for their telephone numbers. He must have been really attractive, because 10% gave it to him without anything. Really? But 18% gave it to him if he touched them on the arm first. Touch. Touch folk this week. That is a connection that we can all make. Paul talks about greeting one another with a holy kiss. That's a little outside of our culture, but a loving hug will probably work. I've heard people say, well, how about a holy handshake? Nah, doesn't cut it. Just a touch. Just a touch. Who knows? It might actually bring new life.